So lovely to see everybody. As Vicky said, I'm Emma Jones and I'm part of the cities team at Ashden. And earlier this year, I worked with Vicky on the role of procurement in helping local authorities meet their climate emergency commitments. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a setup by giving an outline of the sort of scale of the opportunity here. So this slide shows us how much money was spent just by English local authorities in 2019-20 on third-party spend. So overall, it's a massive £63 billion of public money being spent. And this gives you roughly the breakdown of that. So a big chunk of that on vulnerable citizens. You've also got big sections on buildings, highways and transport, waste and environment, and then all sorts of other smaller categories like professional services, civil defence, etc. So if you think about the amount of money that each council is spending, that's a huge amount of power that councils have to affect how that money is being spent in terms of carbon intensity, basically. So if we just think again about the scale of the opportunity, so we found some research that had been done for London. It's quite out of date now, it's 11 years old, but it was the most up-to-date we could find when we were putting this series of workshops together. So this study found that for London councils, and it will be a bit different across the country, but it's probably a roughly accurate figure, for every £1 million of council spend, you've got 337 tonnes of carbon dioxide being emitted. So scaling that up across all the public sector spend, that's 11.2 million tonnes of carbon every year. They also found that if each average council could change their procurement practice to equal that of the best council, they'd be saving 179 tonnes of carbon dioxide for every £1 million they spent. So with a council of a population of about 100,000 people, we worked out that that equates to around 12,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide per annum. Now, if you wanted to try and find another way to cut that amount of carbon for your council, an alternative would be to bring 12,000 homes up to an EPCC. Now, that's an awful lot harder, in our opinion, than tweaking your procurement practices, and also very expensive. That would cost you about £100 million. So that's really just to give you a flavour of the sort of opportunity. There's an awful lot of carbon saving at stake here. So the key opportunities really relate to what you can do to require your suppliers to demonstrate, first of all, that they're minimising the carbon that is produced through actually delivering the service or providing the goods that you're procuring. But also the bigger impact of that is actually requiring suppliers to demonstrate that they've got credible plans to achieve net zero, ideally in line with the council's own plans. And then beyond that, you can also look at encouraging suppliers to liaise with their own supply chain on net zero. So this pie chart shows you broadly the breakdown of suppliers' CO2 emissions. So you can see that actually their supply chains are more than half of it. The electricity section, arguably, you don't need to worry about too much because the grid will be decarbonising. But in the short term, there are also opportunities for suppliers to switch to lower carbon sources of electricity. But there's a huge scope for cutting carbon. So it's a complex area. We know it's not as simple as just waving a magic wand and saying all suppliers need to be net zero by 2030 or whenever it is you've set your own target. Another piece of research found that each individual council has anywhere from around 100 to over 1,000 suppliers. So that's an awful lot of people to be engaging with. And different categories of spend have very different average carbon intensities. And also the level of spend will vary enormously between councils. So for example, street and traffic management is much more carbon intensive than playground equipment and maintenance, 163 tonnes per £1 million spend versus 502. But you've actually got one council spending 20 times as much on street traffic management as another. So depending on how your spend breaks down, you'll be able to decide which category you should be focusing on. So just to give you a quick flavour of how some other councils are approaching this. So one of the questions that we find councils grappling with is what do they do about their different scopes of emissions? So you've got scope 1 and 2, which is your direct control, and then scope 3 emissions over which a council might have stronger or medium control, depending where it falls. So carbon, so Cheshire East has defined its carbon footprint according to these scopes. And it found that actually the emissions it has direct control over are less than 1% of the area's emissions in total. Whereas when they look at the scope 3 emissions and they look at the areas over which they've got stronger and medium control, so things like schools, waste, business travel, employee commuting, that's actually 3% of the area's emissions. And almost all of that comes from procurement. So their council members have agreed that all of those emissions should be included in the targets they've got for their own estate, which is an earlier target than the target they've got for the council area as a whole. And we talked very briefly earlier about the level of engagement you need to undertake with your supply chain, and that might be a very enormous number of suppliers. And it can be quite overwhelming to think about where you start with all of that. But just as a little idea for you, the leader of Sutton Council, once their council had declared a climate emergency, they wrote to all their key stakeholders to say that they were declaring a climate emergency. They were urging all their stakeholders, including suppliers, to join them and play their part in reducing carbon emissions. So it's a way of giving suppliers a heads up that this is on the cards, and really giving them an idea that if they want to continue to be providing services and goods to the council in the longer term, they're going to have to be looking at how they can cut their carbon in line with the council's own objectives. And just one other idea around that, in South Lakeland, they're actually helping their local businesses to cut carbon and develop green accreditation. So they've partnered with a local business that's actually offering small business certification to businesses that want to basically develop an environmental management plan and have a plan for cutting carbon. So the council is actually offering a 50% subsidy to all small businesses in their area who go through this process of getting accreditation. And it then means that those businesses are really well placed to win work from the council. They've already got 20 businesses now certified. They're looking at ramping that up. And they're also looking at actually supporting a carbon footprinting tool to be developed for businesses to use. So again, they can be helped to demonstrate to the council that they're cutting their carbon, and they would make a good supplier for the local authority. So that's just a quick flavour of the scale of the opportunity and a few of the things that councils can be doing. As Vicky mentioned, we've got a whole host of resources on our website under the Learning Out Loud programme, and I think Simon's already shared a link with you. I would urge you to go and take a look at it. There are videos, there are presentations based on the workshops that we did earlier, all sorts of expert presentations that you can take from and learn from that will help you in terms of tweaking your procurement. So I'll hand back to Vicky now to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Great.